Hey there. So I'm out west right now. I'm out here. I'm in Utah right now. I'm out here doing some photography, and I'm just kind of hanging out, waiting for the light to improve. It's still a little too harsh, a little too bright right now to be doing anything. And while I was hiking out here, I was actually thinking about a video that I was editing earlier this morning, a video from out here. And typically when I make a video from the field, I include photos in it, of course, and then alongside those photos, I include metadata, like, exposure information, camera lens, all that kind of stuff. And while I was out hiking, out here, I was thinking about it. And I was like, I wonder if people even understand, why that information is even published, like why that's even shared in the first place. Is there some practical benefit to it? Well, let me break it down for you line by line. So the first thing you oftentimes will see there is the f-stop, the aperture. Because I do landscape photography, landscape and outdoor photography, my aperture is almost always between f11 and f16 or f22, somewhere in there. I never go higher, or I never close down my aperture tighter than f22, and I never really open it larger than f11 either. I'm not a portrait photographer. I don't really do like shallow depth of field photography. I don't, typically shoot things close to the camera and then blow out the background with bokeh and all that. It's just not the style of photography that I do. I do mostly landscapes and this kind of stuff, where I want the image to be sharp and detailed from corner to corner and edge to edge, and to be sharp through the image. And it's also part of the reason why I don't bother with prime lenses that have like f2.8, f1.4, f1.2. No point in having those lenses for me. Like, I'm perfectly happy with a variable zoom that has a maximum aperture of like f4 or even f5.6, because I'm always at f11 or higher. Also, f11 to f22 is generally what I found to be like the sharpest focal length range that is on Fuji GF lenses. I shoot with 3 different GF lenses, the 32 to 64 to 45 to 100 and the 100 to 200. And I think they all have a maximum aperture of f4. And I never even go to f4 on those things. So I'd never even bother with it. I'm always at f11 to f22. And I never go higher than f22 or smaller than f22, because when you go beyond that, then you start getting into diffraction, and then you start losing image quality. Yeah, it's the sweet spot is definitely between f11 and f22 for me. All right, then the next thing is shutter speed. I shoot typically with a tripod. And when you have the camera locked down on a tripod and it's stable and there's not wind and there's minimal vibrations, well, it doesn't really matter what your shutter speed is. It could be, it could be 1/60th of a second, or it could be, a minute long. And the times in which I get concerned about the shutter is when I'm shooting and there's wind and there's vibration. I've had a lot of wind on this trip, and it helps to have a lens that has an optical stabilizer in it. It's not just useful when shooting handheld. You could turn it on when you have your camera mounted to a tripod too, and that can help mitigate some vibration. But I typically don't want to leave the shutter open too long when there is wind, because it introduces the risk of blurry images. And also, I don't like to leave the shutter open for like a really long time with my Fuji GFX 100S Mark II, because I find that when I leave it open for a long time, and I don't know if this is dependent on temperature or what, but I found that when I leave it open for a long time, I'll get like sensor errors in the raw image. I'll get little bits and blops and like little pixelated things in the image, which I have to go in and fix. And nobody would see it if the image was reduced down to a thumbnail. But if I made a print, then yeah, you would totally notice it. If I'm concerned about wind, and if I'm concerned about vibration and the shutter is too slow, then I'll consider opening up the aperture just a little bit more, or raising my ISO in order to help the camera, give the camera a helping hand, in other words. So shutter speed, again, no real mystery there. All I'm doing is just adjusting shutter when I'm taking an image, using my preferred aperture and the lowest ISO I can get, and then just adjusting the shutter speed in order to get, in order to achieve a proper exposure. I generally shoot at the lowest ISO on my Fuji, which is 80. Most cameras, it's 100. And the reason for that is not simply because of noise. You get the lowest, noise level, the cleanest image when you shoot at the lowest ISO. But it's also because the dynamic range of a digital sensor is typically broadest at the lowest ISO setting. And then as you raise ISO, the dynamic range tends to incrementally go down. Not a lot, mind you, but it is definitely at its greatest range at the lowest ISO. So like my GFX 100S Mark II, I mean, I think it has a dynamic range of like a little over 15 stops or something when it's shooting at ISO 80. But if I need to mitigate vibration, I need to help the camera out a little bit, I'll bump the ISO up a little bit. And even if I get some noise, that's okay. I can, clean it up later with Topaz, Photo AI or denoise in Lightroom or something like that. Okay, then there is, the camera body and the lens, of course. I already talked about those things. Most people know what it is that I shoot with. But, in case someone doesn't know, I include that in there. But then the last bit of information that's in there that I think is potentially the most useful, and the thing that I think people may get the most value out of, is the focal length. Because the focal length tells you so much about how an image was composed. Because there is a world of difference, obviously, between like an ultra wide and a wide and a standard and a telephoto focal length, in the appearance of an image. It looks completely different, when you have these different focal lengths. And by including the focal length, in the image information, I'm sharing not just, the lens that I used, but also how I chose to compose the image, the focal length that I intentionally used in order to capture it. And I think that can be the most useful bit of information in there because focal length is universal, right? I mean, it applies to every camera. Honestly, at this point, like, as I've said, I think a couple of times by now, I mean, I tend to use almost always the same aperture, the same ISO if I can, and then just adjust shutter speed to get a proper exposure. And then it's all about focal length and then figuring out where I want, how I want to position the camera, how far I want the subject away to feel, whether the foreground is important, whether I need to shoot wide or whether I need to push in. And that is where focal length comes in. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful. Hopefully that that clarifies exactly, what that information is and, what, if anything, you're supposed to take away from it. Yeah, I hope that was helpful. I will see you next time.